president steps to the microphone to deliver his speech. The crowd has been waiting to deliver theirs. That's Mexico City in 1970. 16 years later, another president walks up to that exact same microphone, and the crowd delivers the exact same verdict, only this time it's louder. There's a stadium in Mexico City that has hosted 2 World Cup finals. Pelé won one of them, Maradona won the other. It's the only stadium on earth where both Pelé and Maradona lifted the same trophy. But the Estadio Azteca holds another record, one that nobody ever put on a bronze plaque. Every time a Mexican president has stood at its microphone to open a World Cup, the crowd booed him. The stadium kept the score honestly, even when the government didn't. 2 World Cup openings, 2 presidents stepping to the microphone, and 2 massive crowds deciding to boo them on a global stage. This isn't a sports story. Far from it. It's the story of the only honest institution in an authoritarian state. The illusion of 1970. To grasp the magnitude of a stadium booing a president, we have to look at how Mexico was governed at the time. It was a period of absolute regime dominance. Public dissent was heavily managed. It was systematically suppressed. The Partido Revolucionario Institucional, like a PRI, had governed Mexico without interruption since 1929. The PRI wasn't just a political party, it was a vast, inescapable architecture of loyalty and controlled speech. The system relied on a grand bargain. The state promised growth and stability, an era they called the Mexican Miracle. In exchange, the citizens would grant total obedience and let the party govern unopposed. For 3 decades, that promise largely held. But there was a severe, violent gap between the official narrative and historical reality. On October 2nd, 1968, just 10 days before Mexico City was set to open the Olympic Games, the Mexican army opened fire on student demonstrators at the Plaza de las Culturas in Tlatelolco. The massacre was initiated by the Battalion Olympia. This was a plainclothes paramilitary group, and they identified themselves by wearing a single white glove on their left hand. They fired into the crowd from the surrounding buildings. It was an intentional trap designed to provoke the regular army into returning fire. Afterward, the government claims 20 people died, and they blamed student snipers. That eyewitnesses and independent investigations later placed the death toll at over 325. The press printed the official story without question. The Olympics opened on schedule, and society was forced into a deep, traumatized silence. 2 years later, the World Cup arrived in Mexico. The government was financially exhausted from hosting the Olympics, so they let private enterprise shoulder the burden. Television magnate Emilio Azcárraga and FIFA Vice President Guillermo Cañedo engineered the bid. They promised FIFA advanced color satellite broadcasts, a huge technological leap at the time. For the government of President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, the tournament was a powerful ideological tool. It was used as a pressure release valve for a society simmering with silent resentment. Díaz Ordaz explicitly tied the tournament to national honor. He handed the flag to the players, telling them it symbolized the homeland and its institutions, and he demanded they play to the death. The press went right along with it, elevating support for the national team to a solemn patriotic duty. The state wanted managed obedience, but what the tournament actually produced was an unstructured, spontaneous occupation of public space. When Mexico beat El Salvador 4-0, thousands of citizens poured into the streets, gathering at the Ángel de la Independencia monument. This crowd included workers, students, and the very same youth the government had violently repressed in 1968. They climbed the bronze lions, they sang the national anthem. It was an unscripted, organic release of pure joy. But the crowd had already quietly delivered a very different message. At the opening ceremony of the 1970 World Cup, President Díaz Ordaz received a massive round of boos, a rechifla, from the stadium attendees. The tightly controlled domestic press buried this dissent completely. Major sports dailies described the ceremony as brilliant and emotive. So the escape valve appeared to work. The PI's image remained intact on paper, and the state's dirty war, the systematic hunting of guerrilla groups and dissidents, continued in total silence. The silence imposed in 1970 couldn't hold forever. The PRI's central promise, that grand bargain of economic stability and the Mexican miracle, began to visibly and catastrophically collapse. By the time President Miguel de la Madrid took power, the country was enduring the worst debt crisis in its modern history. Inflation skyrocketed to 100%. The IMF arrived, bringing conditions of severe austerity. Real wages in the manufacturing sector plummeted by 32%. State subsidies were dismantled. And in the northern states where opposition parties actually began winning municipal elections, the PRI resorted to widespread, blatant electoral fraud to maintain their grip. The state was abandoning its promise of protection. The public's belief in the system was evaporating. Then came the morning of September 19th, 1985. At 7:19 a.m., a massive 8.0 magnitude earthquake shattered Mexico City. It killed thousands and collapsed over 3,000 buildings in an instant. The state's response was complete paralysis. The government went on the radio and ordered citizens to return home and wait, while children hiding under the sheets. When the military finally arrived, they didn't bring shovels or rescue dogs, they brought assault rifles. President de la Madrid minimized the disaster and initially even rejected international aid. Ignoring government orders, they bypassed the paralyzed state entirely. A society of the rubble formed right there in the dust, as everyday people began digging survivors out with their bare hands. This exact moment marks a permanent shift in Mexican history. Working class women from neighborhoods like Tepito arrived at the ruins long before any government officials, carrying massive pots of rice and beans to feed the volunteers. Students and even marginalized youth gangs formed highly effective rescue brigades. More than 1,500 people were pulled alive from the wreckage by citizens. Out of this profound trauma, new organizations were born. Los Topos were the moles, rescue brigades, the National Union of Seamstresses, and the Assembly of Barrios. The earthquake revealed a powerful truth. Mexican civil society could govern itself. The PRI's long-standing claim that the people required a strict paternalistic state just to survive, that was proven entirely obsolete. This newly awakened civil society have lost its fear of authority in the rubble, and they soon found themselves facing another massive state spectacle. Just 8 months after the earthquake, Mexico opened the 1986 World Cup. Why? Well, the sources point to a decisive factor. FIFA President João Havelange was repaying a profound political debt to Televisa executive Guillermo Cañedo, who had previously helped secure Havelange's presidency. The economic contradiction of hosting was stark. Let's look at the math. The government, overseeing a literally ruined capital, spent approximately $100 million on infrastructure. They promised the public a $600 million economic multiplier. That multiplier completely failed, bringing in only a fraction of the projection. Meanwhile, Emilio Azcárraga Televisa monopolized the lucrative fruits of the event. They generated $20 million purely from television advertising, plus exorbitant fees charged to foreign broadcasters. The dynamic was clear. The state absorbed all the burden and private enterprise captured all the windfall. The citizens of Mexico City were still surrounded by the devastation of the earthquake. They saw this glaring disparity clearly. Left-wing groups identified the World Cup as the largest dose of opium the people would ever receive, a lavish distraction meant to cover up austerity and loss. But the audience was no longer persuaded by state propaganda. The public's explicit rejection echoed through the streets in a simple, profound chant. No queremos goles, queremos frijoles. We don't want goals, we want beans. Which brings us to May 31, 1986. President Miguel de la Madrid steps to the microphone of the Estadio Azteca to inaugurate the tournament. He intended to broadcast the message that Mexico was still standing, still strong. Instead, a crowd of 100,000 people unleashed a deafening, unprecedented booing that completely drowned out the stadium speakers. This was the very same society that had spent the previous 8 months governing itself in the rubble. They utilized the anonymity and the massive scale of the stadium to safely and publicly humiliate the president. The fear was gone. The domestic press, which was still closely allied with the regime, attempted one final illusion to cover up this public humiliation. The sports daily Esto omitted the booing entirely. They absurdly claimed that his defective sound system made the president's speech inaudible. But subtle cracks in journalistic obedience were finally appearing. The newspaper La Afición published a clever fictional dialogue. In it, characters joked about the crowd's whistles, and then abruptly ended their conversation out of fear that the government would apply the gag law to them. They couldn't report the truth directly, but they ensured the reading public knew exactly what had happened. But the sources reveal that in 1986, the propaganda failed entirely. The broadcast itself was a global disaster, with scrambled audio feeds sent worldwide. More importantly, the public actively refused to be pacified. The civil society that awoke in the dust of 1985 didn't dissolve back into submission after the tournament. It became the organizational infrastructure for democratic opposition. They proved that the state could no longer dictate the terms of public expression. Pelé lifted the trophy here. Maradona lifted it here. The people of Mexico City never lifted a golden trophy. But what they took away from the Estadio Azteca, first in the silenced whistles of 1970 and then in the deafening roar of 1986, was something far more endearing. They walked away with the realized power to challenge an empire. The state controlled the television feed, the printing presses, and the official narrative, but ultimately, the people kept the score. Basta. This is Mexico.